Hello, welcome to the King's Pavilion and to the WayWORD Festival. This event, this festival, is brought to you by the Word Centre for Creative Writing with the generous support of Creative Scotland, Aberdeen City Council and the University of Aberdeen. We're delighted to be able to have Timothy Baker and Helen Taylor with us today. My name is Sarah Sharp. I'm a lecturer in Scottish Literature at the university, and I'm very excited to be chairing today's session. So before we get started, a wee bit of housekeeping. I'd first of all like to introduce our BSL signer. We're delighted to have Leslie Crerar to provide BSL interpretation for us here today, as you can see. The format of today's session is that I'll be introducing our two speakers, and they'll be giving us short readings from their forthcoming and recently published memoirs. And then I'm going to be asking a few questions about those works before we open it up and give you guys an opportunity to ask the questions you've got. Which brings me to introducing these two fabulous writers. So, how do I introduce Professor Timothy Baker? Well, I'll maybe use a few of the words of one of my first students at Aberdeen, who was asked to make a new friend in their first class of term, turned to the person beside them and immediately said, confident of a shared opinion, did you have Tim Baker last year? He's a legend. Slightly hurtful. But in all seriousness, Timothy Baker is a long-standing member of the English Literature Department at the University of Aberdeen, where he teaches Scottish and contemporary literature. He's the author of 4 previous books, most recently New Forms of Environmental Writing, Gleaning and Fragmentation. Today, he'll be discussing his latest work, Reading My Mother Back, which is a genre-bending memoir that explores his memories of his mother through a focus on the books they shared. I'm also absolutely delighted to welcome Helen Taylor, who also has a long-standing connection with our university. She's also a bit of a literary legend herself. An accomplished essayist and novelist, she's also a founding member of the Women's Writing Network, which connects women writers on Twitter, and has spoken extensively about the craft of writing, including in a workshop earlier this week for this festival. Her work has appeared in Boundless Magazine, Product Magazine, Poetry Scotland, and as part of the Unmother project at the Brighton Fringe 2021. Before becoming a writer, she was a doctor and a research scientist. Today she'll be talking about her forthcoming memoir, Love Laid Down Beside Me and We Wept, a raw account of love and mental health crisis. So welcome to you both. It's such a pleasure to have you both here. I thought we might start the session with your introductions and excerpts from both your wonderful books. Timothy, could I maybe start by asking you to give us some context for the section of your book you're reading, and reading as your chosen memoir bit?
So the context I'll give is pretty limited, and I am going to sit rather than stand, I think, because it's comfortable in this chair. But this is, as Sarah said, a book about my mother, who died fairly young, and rather than writing a biography, I decided to tell it through children's books. So I'm just going to read the first half of the first chapter, which kind of lays out the foundations you need to know. So it starts with the story of Babar. Funerals are easy. There are surprises, of course. The weight of the coffin and the terrible fear it might slip as you walk down the aisle. The need to memorize attendance. The fact that you don't cry. But so much of the day is occupied with pleasantries, with small talk, with setting up and packing up the food at the reception, that you can distract yourself. Thank you. Me too. I'm just here until Monday. Thank you. The same conversations again and again, a lulling rhythm of condolence. The day after the funeral is hard. You wake up in your childhood home in a guest bed overladen with wool blankets, although you can't get warm, and you're alone. Your father is out somewhere with someone. You eat some pasta salad left over from the reception. You watch half of a ball game, not caring who's playing. You pace, and you pace, and you pace, and then you search. For years, you've been so sure your mother was working on a secret project. She loved words, she loved pens and blank books, she loved stories. And her story was so extraordinary, so singular, she must have wanted to preserve it. So you start simply, in her desk. A few plans for garden designs drawn so carefully there was never a chance of them being realized. A few calligraphic exercises, some blank cards just in case. But nothing. You start to panic. You look in the leaves of books she loved, under the bed, in wastebaskets, in the violin case, and through the sheet music that is still laid out in every corner of the house. You spend hours wondering what you're missing, but there is nothing. Your mother has died, and there are no words. She has already begun to disappear. So this is the story of my mother and of her death. And I cannot tell you her story, not really, and so I must rely on the stories of others. Much of what follows is apocryphal. Almost certainly some of it is misremembered. But there is no one left who knows the whole truth, and the stories are what I have. So this is the story of a woman who told her own stories and told others. It is the story I have to tell to make her real. And it is the story just as much of the stories we shared and of the animals that filled them, a world of fable and romance that we lived in, talked about, ran away from, abided by. For my mother was a reader and I am a reader, and all I can do now is read back to her. Marie Helen Leffler was born on the 23rd of September, 1955, to two teachers, their oldest child. Their names might not be important here. Her birth certificate shows that she was born in Washington, D.C. Her parents did not live in Washington, and there were plenty of available hospitals in their Baltimore neighborhood. Someone, for some reason, decided she shouldn't be registered there. Or maybe there was a problem, never revealed, never spoken of. But she was born in the wrong city, the first displacement, the first secret of all the rest. The stories of her childhood don't cohere. Much of it was spent in Baltimore in a series of lower middle class and immigrant neighborhoods, some of it in New Jersey, where she stayed only long enough to pick up some Yiddish that would pop up unexpectedly in conversation later in her life. At some point when she was in middle school, the family seems to have fled New Jersey, perhaps because her father struck someone with his car. Once my mother speculated that her father killed a boy in a hit and run, a story my father cautiously confirms. Certainly my grandfather had a breakdown of some sort. He taught algebra, which neither my mother nor I could ever master. I cannot recall what he looked like, but remember vividly a description of him standing over the stove cooking pasta, the sauce running down his bare chest through what my mother described as surprisingly pendulous breasts. He worked as a bellhop too, proud to have carried the bags of Stevie Wonder the first time he came to Baltimore. Her mother might have worked, might not have. She became a teacher and a Catholic later in life, I believe, although I do not know if either conversion was a surprise. There was a sister born a few years after my mother. Her stories are not the same ones. The four of them lived in Baltimore and they hated each other, and my mother looked for escape, and her escape was a farm. Her mother's parents were, by her account, kind people. Their farm was not a farm, simply a suburban outpost, but there's a picture, now lost, of her standing next to them, wheat or cornfields in the background, so perhaps it was a farm after all. My great-grandfather was a chemist who, my mother said, invented a formula for artificial orange flavoring that was used for many years. I am named after him by virtue of an agricultural pun. My mother's grandmother was, well, I don't know. She was a Mohawk Indian, my mother said, or she was from the West Indies, and her surname, Jones, came from a Welsh sailor who was stationed there. Both stories existed, neither is necessarily true. She learned to cook in Louisiana. She never became a citizen. She was, I've heard, a servant for a family during the Spanish flu epidemic and tended to the dying. I do not know who her family was or where they lived or where they died. I do not know why she left Louisiana. I do not know her people, her ethnicity, her sorrows. I do not know who she was except that she loved my mother, and her recipe for biscuits is the best I've ever found. Her cookbook, handwritten, is also named with a pun. The biscuit recipe is on page 11, and whatever the recipe was originally titled, they were only ever called page 11 biscuits. These are not shoring fragments. They do not form a picture. There are gaps, lies, misrememberings. My mother did not claim any childhood friends, although surely there must have been some. She did not speak about her school, about her neighborhood, about her home. She spoke about a legacy of violence and didn't speak of it. Her world from childhood was already asunder, never to be repaired, never to be whole. So I have to start with a different story, the story of Babar. In 1983 to 84, Jean and Laurent de Bruhoff were given a touring exhibition of watercolors, celebrating 50 years of Babar. It visited Minneapolis, Washington, D.C., San Diego, San Jose, Evanston, Cedar Rapids, and Baltimore, and consisted of 214 drawings of Babar, 87 by Jean and 127 by Laurent. I like these numbers, this itinerary, the fact that I can sit in my office in a university in northern Scotland and find something that seems reassuringly true. My parents and I saw the exhibition in Baltimore, of course. Picture us. I am 5 years old, and the pictures are mounted slightly too high for me. I crane my head up, and behind the waists and forearms of the adults around me, I can see the elephants at play. It is my first time in a museum, and I am grateful there are elephants there.
Thank you so much. I'm now going to ask Helen if you'd be able to give us a wee bit of background and read us your excerpt from your work.
Yeah, so my memoir isn't out yet, but the two pieces that are out in the public domain are a little bit tricky in some ways. They're about when I was on a psychiatric ward sectioned under the Mental Health Act. So I thought instead of reading something quite difficult like that, I would read a piece about love. All the names have been changed. I'm going to stand up because I'm a bit of a fidgeter. Is that all right? There I can, yep. So this is right from the beginning of the book, and it's about my first day at medical school. Mark doesn't want to be in this book, but I can't write this story without him. He was there from the beginning, right in the middle of this tangle of love and death and lunacy. Love came for me in a canteen salad bar on my first day of university. In all my wildest imaginings, and trust me, they were plentiful, I would never have believed that a plate full of pasta salad, tomatoes, lettuce, grated carrot, tuna mayonnaise and honey roast ham, our anatomy dissection aversion to cooked flesh had yet to manifest itself. Not to mention a curried rice salad, a Waldorf knockoff, coronation chicken. The 70s were long gone, but the legacy lived on in institutional cooking. Cucumber slices and a beetroot affair, malt vinegar included, plus a bread roll and a packet of crisps, salt and more vinegar, could totally give me the hops, while I simultaneously questioned whether someone so skinny could actually put that amount away. I'd already spotted Mark around the campus in Freshers' Week, and I wanted to be his friend. He had long, dark, curly hair that hung over his face, and clothes that, in my amateur but enthusiastic opinion, walked the trendy side of goth, as if such a thing existed. Black trench coat, stick-leg black trousers, and a shirt that would have been the envy of his purple princeliness. I'd seen him wafting around the student union in a manner that, given that his hair completely obscured his sightline, was irrefutable proof of his familiarity with the place. At gigs, he stood at the back, hunched over a chin-stroking plastic glass of Southern Comfort and lemonade, while a band played and the mosh pit flailed. Moments later, he'd be back on Dance Floor Express, feet and elbows a blur. It was a little surprising that he could dance at all, given how pointy his black patent leather winkle pickers were, but he managed without restraint. I found him, his attire, his moves, his beverage, radically cool. What I could see of his face, behind his hair, limited for the most part to the flash of grinning teeth, was, my heart assured me, to die for. All of this heightened by his hand-waving speech, which, had I been near enough to hear, I would have discovered was accompanied by a jangle of a wristful of cheap bangles. I was smitten, but my awe kept me circling at the outskirts of his field, while he remained entirely unaware of my existence, laying waste to the paradigm that opposites attract. If I mention it now, he teases me. I wasn't cool, he says, you just didn't know any better. Back then, I was just a girl from the sticks. I feign outrage. I met him properly a week later. It was our first official day at university, and we were in the queue to matriculate. Hi. Hi, I said back, shyness and manners preventing me from explaining that he was in the wrong queue. This one was for the medics and dentists. I'm doing medicine, he said. The first of a lifetime of occasions he would read my mind. We registered for our course, signed where we had to sign, and picked up our student cards. On the way out, he hooked up with a bunch of people he knew from school and dragged me along with them for lunch. In the canteen, Mark and his school friends piled ahead of me in the queue. I trailed behind. For the sake of appearances, I ordered one item from the salad bar whilst my insides churned over whether I could justify the unplanned spending. A furtive glance reassured me that no one had remarked on my profligacy. Mark, on the other hand, worked his way along the salad bar ahead of me, picking the aforementioned selection of items. He didn't realise that they were charged per spoonful and not per plateful. The cashier rang up the till. £4.46, she said, or some other extortionate amount. I flinched on his behalf. These were the days when you could still withdraw £5 notes from an ATM, an amount that, if I was careful and rationed my lager habit, could stretch to an entire week. "Oh," he said, "can I put something back?" She stared at him, letting the unbending polyester stripes of her tabard answer for her. Behind him, the clatter of crockery, the pressure of plywood trays sliding along the stainless steel runners hassled him. Ahead, the clang of cutlery, the scrape of chairs, the babble of the lunchtime crowd pulled him onwards. He shrugged and paid up. At this pragmatic and unflustered display, my stomach shot somewhere into my chest cavity and my skin turned inside out. I couldn't actually believe what I had witnessed. I gawped in admiration. My brain shrank a little away from my skull and swelled again on the rebound as I handed over my carefully counted 40p for my single scoopful. Had I fallen in love, or was I getting a migraine?
Thanks so much, Helen. That was lovely. So the first thing I kind of wanted to talk to you guys about was that both of these are memoirs that are concerned with memories that are somehow interrupted or incomplete. And I wondered if you could talk a wee bit about how you reconstructed those experiences for your readers, how you kind of articulate that instability in a text.
You go.
So my approach was very formulaic. It was very, very rule-bound, where I picked certain key features and certain key books, and it was to establish a relationship between each book and each feature. So in some ways, the reading list came first, and it was a research project-based thing. But I think in some ways, what was interesting was, most of what I remember about my mother is in here. There are things that aren't, and it was that process not just of a making peace with the things that I wouldn't be able to find out. There are a couple times where I will tell multiple versions of a story because I genuinely don't know. There are other times where I just skip over things. I'm like, something important happened here, can't tell you what it is. And being able to say, it's okay that there are these gaps, that as long as it works in the service of a larger story. If that sort of answers your question, I don't know about you.
Yes, so because of what happened to me, and because as part of my illness I had ECT, I have huge gaps in my memory, and when I was very ill in hospital, I kept a notebook. I think it was part therapy. I don't think it was with an eye on the future, but that was certainly a source of some of the information and to trigger my memories of scenes that went in it. But I'm really honest in the memoir, like right at the beginning, I say I'm not to be trusted. I am the classic unreliable narrator. But I think it's really important to recognise that anybody's version of the past is just a version, and there's several different versions of the truth. And more importantly to me than getting the specific timeline exactly right was to have an emotional truth in the book, and that's what I was aiming for. At one point I did consider getting my hospital notes and looking at them, but I decided for two reasons not to do it. One, I thought it would be re-traumatizing for me. But secondly, I thought it would constrain me to make my story fit the document that I had in front of me. So I decided to do it from my tattered memory.
It's interesting to think about narrative potentially as a form of control. It really interests me that something in you wanted to record even as you were there, or wanted to write down and process. And I feel like both of you in ways with your texts are thinking about the way that narratives help us to control our world or to understand our world, and that might not be the same as having a perfect chronological account. I suppose that's a comment, not a question. I'm so sorry.
It's a comment I agree with.
Yes,
Long
and
nod.
I agree with.
No, absolutely. And Helen, you've previously published a novel, and I was really interested in the transition from fiction to life writing. Did you find the writing process really different? I'd imagine it would. Was it more difficult?
It was different, but not as difficult as I imagined it to be. I'm writing about some really tricky stuff, but it did happen to me a long time ago. And I think I can only write about it with the distance of time and the fact that now I'm well. I certainly wouldn't have been able to write these things when I wasn't completely well. In terms of sort of the craft of it, I changed everybody's name so that I could treat it in the same way that I treated a work of fiction. It's not. It is my truth, but I needed to have a distance to treat myself as a character, and you know, creative non-fiction uses the same techniques as fiction in many ways. So it wasn't such a huge difference as perhaps you might think. Yeah.
No, that's super interesting. And for both of you, I sort of was thinking about the way that life writing is necessarily kind of about self-revelation. And I wondered if you could talk a wee bit more about what it's like to share your own difficult or private experiences. And do you worry about the way that readers are going to respond? How does it feel to kind of talk about things that you maybe carry with you rather than share all the time?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't change all the names. I just only used one name once, and no one else is named. And if you try to do your research and figure out, there's a lot about my mother's family, and it's not terribly positive. You cannot find them from the material presented in this book. And it was really important to me that even though most of those people are dead, most of them I certainly have had no contact with in 30 years, so I don't think I'm on their radar. But it was really important that the people discussed in the books could not be seen to be real people, because in a way they're not real people. They are a combination of different stories I have heard about them and my own memories, and I don't want to say that's exactly who that person was. They were lots of different things. But in terms of the sharing aspect, going back to what Helen said about control and your comment, you know, I think one of the things I was really delighted to find when I wrote this was that I didn't have to talk about things I didn't want to talk about. You know, that there, you know, everything in here I think is in here on purpose, and there is stuff that is not in here on purpose. But at the same time, you know, the book's been out a week and a half. And it turns out that when you write a super personal book, people tell you what they think, which is mostly really lovely. But it is something where people who come from very different backgrounds are reading very different books. And people will say, this is a book about this is a book about that. The first interview I did about it was someone who didn't talk about the grief and memoir stuff at all. I was like, this is a very nice book about children's books. And that was our conversation. And I was really happy that they had read a nice book about children's books, which isn't quite what I think this is. But yeah, that idea that once it goes out, it's really not yours anymore. And to that point that if all the people in this are sort of composites, I'm one of those composites, that it's not about me anymore.
I'm glad that this isn't my first book, that I have already done a novel and gone through the process of having of that experience of it going out into the world and not becoming yours anymore, and having people respond to it in different ways. And mostly it was really positive for my novel, but there were a few people that didn't get it. And for the first one, that's always quite hard. You want to say, no, but. And I think I don't know what it will be like to put the whole novel out there, memoir out there, rather. And if somebody responds negatively to it, it'll be a bit harder to treat it as a piece of work that you're distanced from, because it is a memoir. On the other hand, I was determined not really to hold back. My story is quite dark in places, and I didn't want to shy over that. I didn't want to make it like a Pollyanna story. And when before I started this, I had written an essay, and I got it published. I wrote it a long time ago as part of one of my writing courses, and didn't have I wasn't well enough to share it openly. It took me quite a long time to do that. And when I did, I was stopped in the car park by a woman that I know, not very well, who thanked me she was crying, for sharing the story. And I said to her, but it's not actually that redemptive. And it turned out that her husband had been extremely unwell. And she said to me that reading my piece, she felt really seen, and that it was something really helpful for her, even though it was difficult. And it was that made me realise that I couldn't really hold back. So I've probably completely overshared, and it's hanging my dirty laundry out in public or something. But I feel like it sounds totally up myself, but I feel like it's a message that's more important than my own story. Mm-hmm. So.
No, absolutely. I wonder if when we write things, we're sort of anticipating the bad things people will say, but there's ways that we can only connect when we share things, right? And when we talk about the truth and how we experienced it, or our version of the truth.
There's obviously a fear that people will react negatively, but I think I'm strong enough to realise that there's more important things than if somebody reacts negatively. And overall, because of the way that I'm publishing my book, I'm doing it through a crowdfunding publisher, and I have to get pre-orders effectively. And so I've been contacting people, and so many people have messaged me with their own stories of mental health or their children who are struggling, and it just feels like it's really a subject that's resonating, and that's given me the confidence to carry on and put it out there.
That sounds fab. On which note, please do look up the crowdfunding for this book so that we can all have a good read of it.
Unbound.com.
So, Tim, I wondered if you could talk a wee bit about the books that inspired you and why you picked the particular text that you did in this memoir.
So I'm going to do that horrible academic thing and answer it in two completely different ways. Because I did, like I said, I did a lot of research for this, which wasn't research into the things it's about. So I read a lot of memoirs of people reading children's books, which is a genre. And there are some which are good and there are some which are bad, but there are a lot of them. And I read a lot of sort of life writing things. And the form, I'm hoping this gets reviewed. If you know people who, review books for the broadsheets, please tell them to review my book. But there is, someone will say, oh, you're just ripping off Maggie Nelson. And I kind of am ripping off Maggie Nelson. But it was this one of the things that happened was Emily Pine wrote notes to self. And Emily Pine is an Irish academic who is not a friend. I have had a glass of wine with her at a conference once. I don't think she knows who I am. But she wrote this intensely personal book. And I think all of us of Emily's generation who read this book were like, oh, I didn't know we could use our skills as people who do kind of write for a living, but tend not to think of ourselves as writers. I didn't know we could write like this. I didn't know we could share these things. And so I read a lot of different sorts of life writing. So Jen Ashworth's Notes Made While Falling is kind of the direct inspiration for how this book came to be. It's why it's published with Goldsmiths, because I knew if they liked Jen's book, they might like mine. Really, go read it. So there were a lot of these books working in my head, and almost all of them are in here, that I made a decision very early, because I tried to write this just as a memoir initially. I said, what's actually true is if I write this like an academic, because that's who I am, that's how I think. So it has lots of references, and it has weird bits of academic stuff in it. And in some ways that's partly to be honest, because that is actually my framework. But the other half of the books that I'm actually talking about is there were just a couple rules. So the books had to be books that I read as a child. They couldn't be things I discovered later and thought would fit. They had to be about animals for reasons we can or cannot come back to, and they had to tell a story that was relevant. So one of the books I really assumed that I would be writing about was Robert O'Brien's Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim, because it is a book about a main character who is a rat named Timothy and his relationship with his mother in a time of peril. I was like, this will be absolutely perfect. And it wasn't. There wasn't anything I could say about it that illuminated my mother's life in a particular way. So it was that finding those correspondences of not just saying, here's a thing that happened to my mother, or here's a thing in a particular children's book, but here's the way telling the story of this children's book tells something different about my mother than I could get any other way.
Thanks so much. Sorry, I'm having a slight mic problem there where it was just a bit of dead space. That's fab. I am going to now sort of slightly abuse my position as chair and ask the question that I love to ask everybody who has successfully written something to completion, which is, I feel like every writer has their own little rituals and things they do to get the job done and ways of writing. And I'd be really interested to hear what both of you feel are the sort of strategies you have for writing. What does a typical writing day look like for you?
Well, it took me quite a while to realise that writing didn't necessarily mean sitting down at the computer and putting words on paper. A lot of my writing goes on subconsciously, I think. Whenever I need, for when I was writing Backstreets,
okay, thank you.
when I had a tricky plot line to work out, I'd go out for a run and deliberately not think about it and come back with either that specific problem ironed out or some other new idea. So, yeah, I don't really have a typical working day. I write as much as I can. I love it. My problem isn't sitting down to write. My problem is stopping.
It feels like a good problem to have. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, with this book in particular, it was slightly different. I mean, again, because I did do a lot of walking and running, but I'd also been waiting for 25 years to write this book. And it had very different forms during that time. But basically, I wasn't allowed by stupid rules I made for myself to write it before I was 40. So the day after my 40th birthday, I woke up and started writing the book. But I wrote this in the middle of one of my busiest terms of teaching ever. And so it was an escape. It was, okay, it is 11 o'clock and I'm done answering emails. I'm going to write for an hour. And there were times, there were a couple chapters that I knew would be very hard for me to write. And so for those, I just cleared a weekend, and I was like, I will have a chapter done by the end of this weekend, and then I will never look at it again. So there were those moments, but a lot of it was, I get to talk about this, which is, I mean, I think anyone who writes a memoir is kind of narcissistic inherently, but it wasn't. I get to talk about myself now, yay!
I think it's really interesting that you said that you've been waiting that many years to write it. I have a feeling that it's probably the same for me, without even being conscious of the fact that I was waiting to write it. And so when I sat down to write my memoir, I actually wrote it really quickly. It had obviously been stored up, ready to come out.
This gives me hope. What else did I want to ask you about? I have so many questions that I will have to desist in a minute. But you're both from relatively scientific backgrounds at one point or another. And I wondered, do you think that translates into or influences the way you write or the way you collect information?
So I've got a funny story that I always tell about when I first started to write. I had to stop my research because I wasn't well enough, and we moved, and I thought, right, now I'm going to be a writer, as you do. So I signed up for an Open College of Arts Starting to Write course, and one of the first exercises was to talk about, to use all your senses to just practice your writing skills, and the first one was your vision. So the instruction was to sit down, focus on something, describe it. So I sat down in front of my fire. There were some logs. I thought, right, I'm going to describe that log. And I went, it's 30 centimetres long, has a 15 centimetre diameter. However, it actually came as a surprise to me that scientific research and creative writing are really similar in the way that you use your brain. I thought that research was logical and that creative writing was creative, but I've realised that both of them have a technical side where you learn the craft and an inventive side. You don't advance in research if you don't do kind of some left field thinking, and I feel like I can physically feel the same part of my brain in action when I'm getting some ideas for where my story is going to go, as I did when I was thinking about where my research was going to go. And it took me completely by surprise.
I mean, I was a very bad scientist, which is why I stopped being a scientist. but in some ways, that combination of the logical and the creative, and for me, it's all of my research is very material. Even though I'm not someone who looks at manuscripts or anything, what I do is I make stacks of books and basically reorder the stack of book until the books start talking to each other. And if I have a stack that's in the right order, then I have a thing to write. And that idea that you take something that is in the material world and you translate it, I think does come from the scientific stuff I was doing, where in that case it was brains, and you could be like, I'm holding a brain, but I have to say something interesting about it, which books are much more fun than brains.
I was going to say I would disagree, but I'm not sure. It's my two things.
Okay, I think I might open us up to some questions from the audience now. So if people have things that they would like to ask our two memoirists, if you could just raise your hand. Hello. Oh.
I don't think the mic's on, but I can hear you. So. So there are at least three reasons. One is I grew up on a farm, and And the idea of creating a farm was something really central to my mother's imagination. So I'm from Baltimore originally, and at one point before we left, we lived in the suburbs. And like proper suburbs, but my father had tilled up the driveway, and we had a row of tomato plants, and then in the garage, it was filled with rabbits, which we sold for meat. And this idea that you could make a farm anywhere was something that for my parents, I mean, my parents were this is the 70s, early 80s. It is part of a sort of back to the land ethos. And this idea of we're going to make a farm wherever. So I was a very ready-y child. I spent a lot of time reading, and I was very poorly socialized. And I spent a lot of time with animals. I spent a lot more time with animals than I did with children my own age, and with books. And that was the sort of two things. So it was mainly because I thought that was a way to tell that aspect. The other thing, and this is, I probably shouldn't admit this, but the academic book I wrote before I started writing this was about animal stories in general, and it ended with children's animal stories. And there's something really interesting when you tell people that you're writing about children's animal stories, because everyone remembers a children's animal story from their youth, and they're always sad. And everyone's like, oh God, that horrible story where the cute fluffy dog dies miserably. So it's a totally manipulative way to tap into that, I'm not gonna lie.
Hi there. I'll try to talk loud so you guys can. First off, I love all your guys' outfits. Look fantastic. Thank you. So this is for Tim. I wanted to ask, so obviously memories are a very personal thing, and you said that there's that experience of getting to write about yourself in your book. So how do you balance consolidating your childhood and writing about your mother? How do you make a balance between those two things? So in some ways it had to be in order. So it was my mother came first, and then the texts, and then me. So in some ways, if I could go without talking about my own memories for a while, to me that felt, because I knew the selection process was already me, that was already revealing something about who I was as a person, as a writer. So in some ways, I remember when I was writing the book, I went to the pub with a friend, and it was right after lockdown, and it was the first time in the pub in a while, and I got a little expressive. And so I was like, the book isn't about me, it's not about me, it's just about my mother. And that was not quite true. But I think it is that thing of just, there's that standard thing of a memoir is always about selection, and autobiography is about putting the whole stuff in. And I think if I had been trying to write a book that was about me and my memories, it would have been a really different book.
Thank you. This is for Helen, but it might apply to Tim as well, I'm not sure, so I'll be interested to hear both of you. I know you said that you had to leave quite a distance between your experiences and when you wrote, and you had to be well. I wondered if, I imagine a lot of what you were writing was really distressing stuff. I wondered if it was therapeutic to write about it, or painful, or a mixture of both.
I think that's actually quite a hard question to answer, because I would say that it wasn't therapeutic to write. It wasn't cathartic. But I think that's because I had already had my catharsis about the whole situation and realised where I was. I think writing my novel was the thing that really helped me get well. I was worried about going back and revisiting and thinking, would this be really traumatic? But it wasn't. It was, strangely, it was physically exhausting. When I wrote the memoirs, at the end of each session of writing, I wanted to sleep. But I wasn't upset in a way that I thought that I might be. There are certain bits of it when I speak about it, when I speak about the reasons that I've written things that still make me upset. But generally, it wasn't as traumatic as perhaps you would imagine. I think that there was enough distance, not just in time, but there's a physical distance for me as well. I had to take myself away. I was ill. We were living in Glasgow. I had to physically we moved away because every street that we walked down reminded me of some event or other. Not always bad either, but it was just like overwhelming. So a physical and a time distance allowed me to do it.
Hello. Question for Tim. I recently reread the Narnia books, and slowly, I absolutely adored them as a kid. My father read them out loud to me, but I was slowly getting more and more uncomfortable with what I was reading. And then I got to Voyage of the Dawn Treader with the sort of the Duffelpud section on one of the islands, and I was like, God, this story is about a Christian missionary who is violating the bodily autonomy of a bunch of indigenous people, and then just is kind of vindicated in the end. And I was like, God, that's really creepy. And I was wondering if at all, when you were looking back at all of these stories that you read as a kid, you got to a point where you were like, oh God, what was I reading?
I mean, yeah, absolutely. And it's something that I really struggled with when selecting the texts for this, because basically almost all of the authors I talk about are white men born between 1890 and 1920. Like, that is what I read as a kid. And I really wanted to misrepresent that. I really wanted to say I had this really diverse reading base, and I read all of these great things. I didn't. And so, in some ways, I mean, and I think Narnia is the classic example that everyone who writes sort of books about their childhood reading says, yeah, Narnia's kind of has some issues. But I think the thing, going back and reading the one I write about here is The Magician's Nephew. In some ways, I had that moment of difficulty when I was in my teens, in my 20s. And now I could go back and say, well, these are actually the bits of the story that mattered to me and still matter to me. And, you know, there are bits of all the Narnia books, well, except The Horse and His Boy, which is terrible, but there are bits of 6 of the 7 Narnia books that I deeply, deeply love now. And in some ways, because what I'm doing is so selective, I could say, yeah, when people go back to Lewis and many other writers, I talk about Rudyard Kipling. Going back to Rudyard Kipling is not a comfortable experience. Even for C.S. Lewis, bizarrely. C.S. Lewis talks about going to Rudyard Kipling and saying, oh gosh, there's a lot here that I'm really not on board with. But I think in some ways being able to say, it's okay that the work you read was complicated and had problems, because the bits that spoke to you still matter. You don't have to throw out the entire thing.
Helen, you mentioned that the person, I don't remember his name, but the person that you wrote the chapter about didn't want to be in your book. How do the both of you deal with the idea that someone you know might read your things? Because that seems terrifying to me.
Yeah, so especially because of the way that I'm publishing my book and getting people to support it and buy it in advance, of course I'm asking a lot of my friends to do it and family. But I think that, well, so first of all, I changed everybody's name so that my friends who are in it I didn't feel the need to seek their permission to be in it, because they're not a huge part of it. But the people who have a bigger part, I did give a veto to whether I was going to publish it or not. And reluctantly, no, not reluctantly, it wasn't reluctant. I think there were concerns from my family and friends, that it might be too exposing for me, but not, the concerns weren't about whether they were in it or not. It's all about protecting me. But it is something that I feel really passionate about sharing, and I think is really important.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll say on my side that one of the things is, because the book is mostly about my childhood, most of it is set before I'm 16, because that's when I left home. So I didn't have to worry about like current friends at all. They're just not in it. But I did tell my father that I was going to write it, and then I ignored him for a long time. And then finally, once I had a contract, because I figured before I had a contract, there was no point, I said, okay, it's been contracted, there's a finished manuscript, you don't have to read it, but if you want to read it and stop it, you can. And then, very fortunately, he didn't even read it until the proofs were out, so it would have been too late, but he gave permission anyway. But it was something where extended family, there are people I hope just don't discover it. But it's the nice thing of working with a small publisher. But in general, I think the thing is the people who are affected by things in it, there are some things I think people will have problems with. But if they say there are multiple ways of looking at my own memories, then that's still a really positive outcome for me. If someone finds a different angle on experiences they remember, I still think that's a good thing to do in a way.
I guess just off the back of that question, I'm going to assume that you both had to speak to, if not family, then friends, as part of the research process. Did you ever feel like you were sort of, maybe like dragging's too strong a word, but pulling these people along that journey with you, and how did you obviously decide that was going to be okay and that was going to be part of how you put your books together?
Well, I wrote my memoir without being certain that I was even going to try to get it published. I was in the middle of writing another novel, but it just wouldn't let me go. So it was written first. Then I gave it to the people closest to me to check that they were okay with it, and to check that their memories aligned with mine. And it didn't always, and actually I've written those bits into the book. But also, as I was talking about emotional memory earlier on, and I think that the people closest to me felt that it had got to the emotional truth of it, even if our memories of the specific events varied slightly. And I would like to point out that even though it is a memoir about mental health and really tricky subjects, it is quite funny.
I'm actually delighted that the only people who realize my book are funny are my family, because they know how I speak, and most of I mean, there are two jokes, one of which other people think is funny, one no one else thinks is funny, but there are a couple like turns of phrase that if you know my voice are funny, and if you don't, aren't. But yeah, I was the same in that I didn't ask anyone, because in some ways, at this point, if I learn a truth about something, and there are things in here that I'm wrong about. There's one story that my father says, I have no idea where you got that from. I don't know, but I believed it for 30 years. And to me, the fact that I lived my life believing that story makes it as interesting as whatever the sort of historical truth might be. So yeah, I just shut everyone out.
But even the bit at the beginning of your book, the bit that you read, like all the different versions of the stories that are possibly true, like there's such an honesty in acknowledging that there's loads of different stories and you don't know which one's the truth.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to make claims for this book that it can't support, but I think that idea of if it inspires people to think of their own lives in a more fragmented way, to me that's really positive. And say, I can take all of these little bits and I can have a sort of mosaic approach rather than needing to know the one foundational truth that's at the heart of everything.
We have time for one more question. So does anyone have an absolute beezer? Yes. No pressure.
I will try and arrive at an actual question. I just find it so interesting to hear you both talk about memory and perspective in your writings and the role that distance plays. You both are talking about distance and time, but both of you are also very much like about the physical distance and it's looking back. So in your writing process, and you're talking about very personal things, how did you approach, I guess, kind of the emotional side of what you were trying to convey? So when you're talking about your memories of because you were saying, Helen, that you are well now, so therefore you can talk about the stuff that was really difficult. And obviously you're talking about childhood memories that can be very, like, you know, sore to think about. How did you approach that? Were there any times in your writing where you were like, this isn't conveying the emotions that I need, or this is too emotional, or like not just looking at it being like too distanced? Because I guess you'd want some emotion to be in there. Like, yeah, how did you approach that? And was that in the writing, or was it more in the editing where you were like, or revising it, or being like, oh, actually, this comes across way too cold, or wow, I put too much of myself in there, like, yeah.
That was one of the things that I was talking about yesterday in the Writing About Mental Health workshop, is how difficult it is to portray the emotions, especially really strong emotions, so that your reader feels the same as you did. But I think part of my novel, no, I keep calling it a novel, my memoir, is when I was in the ward, in the psychiatric ward, and it's vignettes, and it's quite, it's very angry. The anger is really obvious because of the swearing. But it's also emotionally distant and tunnel vision. And that's because I was so unwell that I couldn't see outside of myself. And it happened by accident, I think. But I feel that the end product was quite a good reflection of what it was like. And it was only as I got better that I started to see the other people around me, and how, although I intellectually knew how my illness and behaviours were affecting other people, I couldn't emotionally feel it until I got a little bit better. So I think it is quite sort of tunnel vision, very factual, very angry.
In some ways, I had a sort of easy response, which was I could just start talking about a book. But certainly for me, that was an editing where and in both directions, that the first draft of the first chapter, I was doing some really weird things with tense and voice. And I had this whole thing where my mother's life would be in the present tense and my life would be in the past tense. And I thought that was so clever. It was not clever. But there were bits where there's one chapter, and really annoyingly, I don't know what I did, but I finished revising it and it was 3,000 words longer, and I can't tell you where they go. But it was because it wasn't hitting the emotional truth. And I kept reading it and saying, this isn't working. And it wasn't I'm going to do this whole thing. It was like, one by one, change the words, add a new sentence here. I read this book, I read aloud again and again and again. And basically, by reading it aloud, it wasn't about me. And so it was, if I had an emotional response to the writer of this book, then it was working, and if I didn't, it wasn't working. So it was just changing it word by slow word.
I've got one section that's a very extended, completely outrageous metaphor for how I was thinking. And at the end, it's like, of course it's ridiculous, none of it makes sense, but there's no other way to explain it. So...
Well, I think we're going to draw things to a close now, I would just like to say thank you to both of you for being so open and so generous with talking about your books. I've so enjoyed reading both your writing for this, and it's been lovely to talk about it with you. We're going to have a wee book signing after this, which I have a note here telling me is going to be down here now. So stick around afterwards if you would like to purchase a book from Blackwell's, our university book provider. There's a 15% discount during the festival, which is rather nice. So hang around. There'll also be drinks and nibbles if that doesn't tempt you enough. So stay with us. What else did I want? Do I need to say? Sorry, this is the most long list of people to thank. Oh my goodness. Right, I want to thank Leslie, our wonderful BSL interpreter, who asked me not to call her wonderful before I did that. And I would like to also thank the WayWORD Media Services team, which I think today is Lisa and Stacey, but maybe other folks too, so thank you guys. And generally the WayWORD Festival folk for making all this possible. Thank you again to Creative Scotland, Aberdeen City Council and the University of Aberdeen for their generous funding of the festival. And thank you to the dedicated team of students, staff and young people who create and put together this festival. So thank you to you guys, and thank you so much to the audience, and hopefully we'll have the opportunity to have a chat with you afterwards. So thanks again, and goodbye.